In a couple of chapters, I've not been always happy with Grudem, although I respect him immensely. I'm not unhappy with him in this one. I think he does a very good general job, given that this is a topic that is, well, there is much disagreement, but these are in-house disagreements we're going to talk about. And so we're not actually going to explore them heavily. We're just going to kind of skim through this. The return of Christ. When and how, there's a lot of debate about that, but what we do all agree on, all who are in Christ, we agree that he is coming back. And we can have some discussions about some of the other parts of it. Some are more clear than others. Some are more clear than we'd like them to be, and some are less clear than we'd like them to be. But as he looks at it, he talks about a couple of things in his beginning. He talks about he says to begin this final unit, so this final unit we're in is the doctrine of the future. And so what we're going to cover as we look at it, and so we're going to make reference to some things we'll cover more thoroughly later. But in here, we're going to begin with, find that.
They call it eschatology for practice.
Yeah, eschatology is the name. And so the return of Christ we're going to start with. And there's a lot more agreement on that than some of the even later portions. But again, these are all in-house arguments. The millennium, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of opinions. So we'll reference it some, but we're not really going to talk about the millennium itself tonight because we're going to dedicate the next chapter to that. Then there's the final judgment and eternal punishment. There's actually less disagreement there. There are some disagreements that would be outside the pale on that, but we'll talk about, but this is an issue that we all agree on when we get to it. And then the new heaven and new earth. So all of these we have a high level of agreement on, with some difference of opinion on certain aspects. And so that's how he's going to end this. We'll do the return, the millennium, the final judgment, eternal punishment, the new heavens and new earth. That's the last chapters. Now, we'll not be done with this book then, because my intent is, if you look at the appendices, we're going to spend one Wednesday looking. The appendix covers historic confessions of faith. So we will spend one on the Apostles' Creed, one on the Nicene Creed, one on the Chalcedonian, one on the Athanasian, etc. Each one dedicating a night to it as we work through them. And none of them should take more than a night, because we're not going to give them a thorough coverage, but just an exposure and work through them. And that will take us through pretty much everything in the book. But for tonight, when and how will Christ return? Could he come back at any hour? There's debate on that issue. And I like the way he handles it. At the back of this one, he starts off with a verse, 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 18. For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. And I think that's really the thing we need to focus on. He's coming back. Even if we don't agree on all the particulars, we're to comfort each other with these words. And I think if we take that take on all of it, we can go a long way with it. So now he talks about here regarding different future issues, and he mentions what he calls personal eschatology, and then he talks about what's called general eschatology. Now, the personal eschatology is, this events that'll happen to individuals. What's happening in your life toward the end, and toward the end of your life. But under the general eschatology, we're going to deal with the second coming of Christ, the millennium, the final judgment, eternal punishment for unbelievers, eternal reward for believers, life with God in the new heaven and the new earth, so which we've all talked about. So that's those remaining chapters. And that's all under what we call general eschatology. So he breaks it up like this. He begins with there will be a sudden, personal, visible, bodily return of Christ. Okay? And he said, Jesus often spoke of his return. You must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And that's Matthew 24:44. He said, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. John 14:3. Now, he says, immediately after he ascended into heaven, two angels said to the disciples, this Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into the heavens. Acts 1:11. And Paul himself, he points out, taught, the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the archangel's call. It's the verse we just read. The author of Hebrews wrote, Christ will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Hebrews 9:28. So that kind of gives us a feel for the fact that he is going to come back. And his appearing will not be a mere spiritual coming to dwell within people's hearts. That's kind of a liberal mindset to push that, to try to make it, it's like it's not really going to happen. It's a mentality amidst all their other...
I know a Reformed Bible church in the area here,
Yeah.
just south of us, that deals with that. And he said it's only in a figurative sense and it's allegorical and just pulverizes the truth.
So we would call that liberal, actually. Whether they call themselves Reform or Baptist or whatever.
He's a five-pointer clear.
Well, I would say he can't be. He might say he is.
Yeah, he says he is.
If he says he is, but he denies the return,
It's strange.
then there's some issues there. But now, what's interesting, you'll see liberalism rise up in some interesting places. We see them rise up let's take the most reformed we would consider them would be the Presbyterians, right? Well, what do we have? We have constant divisions there of liberalism. That's where PCUSA and then PCA, and they're running into some trouble now. You got several different groups. We got the SBC. We had our big battle for the Bible. I mean, everybody would have thought, Southern Baptists, Baptists are like supposed to be the most fundamental there are, right? But nope. For the longest time, when I first came here, I met a minister in a church whose church had been Southern Baptist, had left them years ago in the 70s, and he had not, I know we like to think the whole world knows what we're doing, but a lot of people don't have a clue what we're doing if they're not in our denomination. And he had no idea that the battle for the Bible had even happened. In his mind, we were still in the 70s. Okay, and so Southern Baptist to him meant liberal. And so he was actually shocked. We had a nice time having lunch together. I tell him, oh no, well these things happen. He just had no idea because it wasn't his concern. And so I would say any who would deny the actual return of Christ, they are outside that. The in-house argument is timing, and a few of the other details. But whether he's coming or not, that's not an in-house argument. That fits with denying the virgin birth, the resurrection, etc. When you deny that, you have stepped outside the in-house argument and gone into something else. So I don't care what he calls himself. It's all form and means nothing.
I think he's reigning in the millennium now.
Right. Well, there's some arguments about that, and I think I know that the argument, my understanding growing up of, which we're going to get into, of amillennialism was that idea, but actually that's the liberal presentation of it. When you get into its real sense, it doesn't quite look the same as that. What liberals did with it, they took all these things and tried to make it like, there's never going to be anything. It's all just going to happen here. We're just going to be heaven on earth, and it's just going to, and that's not what we're talking about. But here's the thing. So, but there will be, and when we say sudden, we're going to talk about it through here. There are signs that we're told we can see, but that doesn't mean we can know when. Right. And so that's where it's going to be sudden, personal, visible, bodily return. So that's point number one. I'd say that there's not, amidst those who are within in the camp, whether we be Presbyterian, Baptist, whether we be Reformed or whatever.
So he left, he's coming back.
Right. So we, I would say, irrespective of denomination or even bent within the denomination, all those who are in the pale, as we'd call it, would believe this. Okay. So we all have debates about particulars of it, but not of it. So therefore, he puts in B, we should eagerly long for Christ's return. John's response at the end of the Revelation should characterize Christians' hearts in all ages. Amen, come Lord Jesus. So we should be looking forward to it. We should be expecting it, although not setting dates. As soon as somebody sets dates, it gets all weird. But we should know that and we're going to get into some of the particulars about, well, could it happen right away, or are there some other things that need to happen? And that's coming up later here. He says, but does this mean that we should not, do Christians in fact eagerly long for Christ's return? A lot of times we don't really look like we eagerly long for his return.
To the world,
well, and it's true, it's what we know. It's what we know, it's what we're comfortable with, and so, the dying and going to be with the Lord or his coming, that's all so strange to us in a sense. So we don't actually often look like we long for it. the more Christians are caught up in enjoying the good things of this life, the more they neglect the genuine Christian fellowship and their personal relationship with Christ, and the less they will long for his return. That's pretty textbook, I would call it. But does this mean that we should not undertake long-term projects because he's going to come back? No, it doesn't mean. Matter of fact, I think he pointed out when he was writing this book, he was expecting, and that's like anything. So, and this was, I think, the part of the problem. Now, when we talk about where Paul says, if you don't work, you don't eat, that can be addressed to indigence, and it is rightly done so, but its original, I think, direction was mainly to the kumbayas. They thought Christ was coming in the next few days, and they said, why go to work? Let's all just sit around and wait for his return. But people were having to make meals and do other things, and while others were doing the work of Martha, in a sense, the others were just sitting around playing drums and singing flutes and looking up in the sky and letting other people take care of the things that had to be done. And that's where he's saying, look, you can't just sit around and say, Christ is coming, let's do nothing. No, you've got to live your life and witness and take baths and cook food and wash dishes and do a lot of other things and work and pay your bills and take care of your kids. And so that's really what this fits. Should we undertake long-term projects? Well, Scripture speaks about the fact that we shouldn't just go say we're going to do stuff without seeking the Lord's face. But the reality is he doesn't expect us to not do anything either. We should be embarking upon long-term projects, especially when there are things that we're seeking to reach the lost. So should somebody, when Christ comes, it's entirely possible there will be people who have trained for years to be missionaries, learned a language, and they're going, and they never get there because Christ comes. But that's okay. You know what they're going to hear? Well done, good and faithful servant, because they were working towards that end. Now, if they were just sitting back saying there's no point in learning a language because he's going to come, why people die and don't hear the gospel, that's not what he wants us to do. So, yes, we should embark on long-term projects, of course, always with our eye to the Lord. To be ready for Christ's return is to be faithfully obeying him in the present, living for him now, looking toward when he's going to come and trusting, So we've got an eye on the things of God while we're working, I put in here in the notes so that we don't suffer from short-timers disease. In the service, when you get down to those last, I assume it's the same in the Coast Guard, guys get down to their last week, they're not very productive. And I think that's partly why he didn't tell us precisely when he was coming, because that's exactly what happened to us. If we knew the exact day, if he said, I'm coming next Thursday, we'd be like, there's just a lot of things we don't need to do. I don't need to show up to work, And so, yeah, he doesn't want us to suffer. He wants us to be ready, but he wants us to be busy. So his section C, we do not know when Christ will return. That's important. As soon as people start trying to set dates, it gets weird. The practical result of this is that anyone who claims to know specifically when Jesus is coming back is automatically to be considered wrong. Now, I mean, they could guess right, but it would be inadvertent, and there'd be no accolades for them if he did show up on the day. And it's probable that there's enough people claiming to know something that somebody's going to, it's like what we call the anchor pool. The docking pool. They had those in the Coast Guard too, right? Everybody pays $1, and they guess within like a 5 to 15 minute block of when they're going to actually dock, and whoever gets the right time gets all the stuff. So there's bound to be...
Or a baby being born.
Yeah. So the odds are good that somebody will have a right guess, but it's not going to be to their credit. But in reality, yeah, nobody knows. And as soon as somebody starts to narrow it down and say, we can see signs that indicate it's near, but we've been seeing signs that indicate it's near for about 2,000 years. And so what we need to know is it could be imminent, and we need to be ready like it's imminent, but we need to be working like it's not. Like God has given us X amount of time to reach people, to live for him, and things like that. All evangelicals agree on the final results of Christ's return. He gave an example of a guy who... let me jump back to our date setting. He had a note here in the footnote that was worth reading. Even in the enlightened 20th century, he puts enlightened 20th century, such alarms can be persuasive to many people. In the summer of 1988, that's when I got out of service, a former rocket scientist with an impressive academic credentials, circulated a booklet claiming that Jesus would return on September 12, 1988. Tens of thousands of copies of the book found their way around the United States and to various parts of the world. I was surprised to find that some otherwise sober Christian friends had read it and were alarmed, and to hear that some Christians in our community had pulled their children out of school in order to be together as a family when Christ came back. When the prediction failed, the author, a guy named Edgar Weisenant, I hadn't heard him either. I was familiar with Harold Camping and some others, and some older ones, Miller and those guys and the Millerites. But anyway, he revised his prediction, saying his calculations were 1 year off and Christ would return instead on September 1st, 1989. Or possibly September 15th through 17th in 1993. Or, of course, those predictions, they failed. Oh, it says, but if not, then it could be on Rosh Hashanah in 1990 or 1991 or 1992. So we're scrambling, okay? Yeah, and so I was like, okay. So that's a picture, but this is not a single account we can find. There are other accounts like this. So anyway, but now to D. All evangelicals agree on the final result of Christ's return. No matter what their difference on the details, all Christians who take the Bible as a final authority agree that the final and ultimate result of Christ's return will be the judgment of unbelievers and the final reward of believers, and that believers will live with Christ in the new heaven and new earth for all eternity. Okay, so that's what we do agree on. And those who don't agree on that, like I said, there are problems. We have problems, and I would say I don't see them as, okay, you have to be careful about this. Somebody who believes that, if there's somebody who should know, many degreed people, I'd say they're not a believer. They could be a very immature, very ignorant believer. But the more education they have and the more time they have in it, the less likely I believe that they're actually a believer. And so and there's a little room there to say that there's some blindness, but there's a certain level you say, no, we can't buy that you were just confused. So is there disagreement? There is disagreement over the details of future events. And he says, specifically, we differ over the nature of the millennium, the relationship of Christ's return to the millennium, the sequence of Christ's return, the great tribulation period that will come, and the question of the Jewish people. Those are issues that we have in-house disagreement on. Their differences concern the interpretation of various passages relating to the event. So we have to recognize they're all going to the same Bible, but they're having different interpretations. And there's a lot of reasons why we can come to different interpretations, but the point is we all agree on the end result. As we come to the text, we don't always come to the same conclusion on that, but as long as we're working from the same text, we have something we can talk about. And so his next section is, could Christ come back at any time? Because you have the two major camps in this area. There's one that says, no, there's too many things that have to be done. You have some that say yes, okay? And but he takes a middle one, which I think is actually the wisest one. And so we're going to kind of skim through those. He said there have been different ways of resolving the apparent tension between these two sets of passages. And he says verses, and he gives a list of verses predicting the sudden, unexpected coming of Christ. Okay, and so here, let me put this where I can jump back and forth.
He's not of the camp to say, as long as we keep the peace, who cares what you believe, type of thing.
No, he's not of that.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but what he had, because that would be going with the lowest common denominator. What he's trying to point out, we have verses that predict the sudden, unexpected coming of Christ, and we have to deal with them. So they're here, and he lists a bunch of them. Matthew 24. I'm not going to read them all. Matthew 24, 42 to 44. Also looking at verses 36 and 39. Matthew 24, 50. Matthew 25, 13. Mark 13, 32 through 33. And these are just some. He has.
They're the parallels to Matthew's 24.
Yeah. Then he has 1 Corinthians 16:22, Philippians 3:20, 1 Thessalonians 5:2, Titus, and he goes on. It's a good list here. And what he does here, he says, as he lists them, he has verses predicting them. So then under that section, he has the next section, signs that precede Christ's coming. Well, a couple of things he says about this. He says, none of the texts just quoted require this interpretation. they don't require the immediate return. The texts say to be ready, but they don't actually say how long the wait is.
Immediate is kind of relative there.
Right. So, but that's what he points out. These are texts that do that. He's not refuting them. What he's just saying is they don't require us to interpret that it could happen right now, but that we ought to be ready.
We can say it's unannounced.
Right. The prophets were little interested in chronology. Biblical prophecy is not primarily a 3-dimension, but 2 is kind of the way he approaches it, which I think is a good way to look at it. It doesn't give us all the details. Now, he says, signs that precede Christ's return, and this is where he gets into, these are the things, well, could it happen right away, or could it be another way? So when he looks at that the preaching of the gospel to all nations, and that's where he has, like, the way I read this is I jumped between the 2 sections.
Is that Matthew 24:14 you're referring to?
Yes. So, but when he jumps, he has 2 different sections on the coming, and so the preaching of all nations, he just gives Mark 13 with reference to Matthew 24:14. The gospel must first be preached to all nations. So, signs that precede Christ's return. He's saying it must be preached to all nations. When he gets into his other section on it, he says here, these verses, he certainly does not mean that every creature, and what he's talking about is like Colossians 1:5-6, the gospel which has come to you as indeed in the whole world is bearing fruit and growing. And then also Colossians 1:23. He also speaks the gospel which you heard, which has been preached in every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. He says these verses, he certainly does not mean that every creature alive has heard the proclamation of the gospel, but that in a representative sense at least, the gospel has been preached to the whole world and to all nations. So and what that would mean is, so you have 2 that's saying, well, it has to be preached to all, but then again, it doesn't mean that every single individual is necessarily going to hear it. He talks about the Great Tribulation here, and he points...
That's even true in our own country.
Yes.
Strangely, it's
Right. And actually, you could have a country that's totally saturated with the gospel, possibly. Even maybe, let's say, everybody in that current generation come to the Lord. And as time goes on and the gospel goes out, you have another generation comes up that does not believe. So you can end up with a nation, kind of like ours looks like, that is less and less people saved percentage-wise over time, even though they were once a nation saturated with the gospel. But anyway, he talks about the Great Tribulation, and he makes reference to, when wars and rumors of wars. And in his next section, he says, it seems likely that the language of Scripture indicates a period of suffering coming to the earth that is far greater than anything. So, and he gets into conversation about, over the years, many have seen, there are some who say that, the tribulation was, and for the ones who say it could come at any time, they would say, the stoutest of them would say that the Great Tribulation was reference to the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, that's one of the for those who would say all the.
But we've had worse things.
Right.
Since.
So,
That killed it.
well, that's what he kind of took. He says, but for those who would say, in the one camp that it could come at any time, many of them would say, well, while there have been other things, that was what they had in mind, and so they look at it as already fulfilled. And yes, we can look over history and see from generation to generation they thought, yes, it was. It's now.
Is the technical term preterist that they apply to that? I can't remember.
He doesn't use that in here. We may get into that. He's just given the basic sense of it, those who believe the tribulation. And then he talks about, after that, he talks about the false Christ, the Antichrist, the false prophets working signs and those things. And I remember when they were saying that Gorbachev was the beast and the mark on it, so, but it didn't begin with him. This thing has been generationally. So there are some who would call out, many of the popes have been called the Antichrist. Now, it does say that there are many Antichrists, and some of these may have been Antichrists. Some of the Roman emperors and stuff, some of the persecutors. But when we talk about the great one, there are many that could say maybe it was fulfilled, but for those who say no, not yet, it has yet to be fulfilled. They say, the powerful signs in the heavens, he kind of covers that. And of course, they just give the one thing, just the verses. But in those days, after that tribulation, and of course in this reference would be the fall of Jerusalem, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light. And I could go into a lot of descriptive explanations for somehow they would try to explain that. But on the other hand, they say that, the powerful signs in the heavens is one sign that almost certainly has not yet occurred. And what they're saying is there's a lot of things that have happened that might qualify, but it seems that these
Lord
are...
didn't land on the Mount of Olives and split the thing in two.
Right, but the real big stuff that we're thinking just hasn't happened. But in reality, as he points out, those things could happen very quickly when they happen. So, but we believe they're not happening. There's some that say they think they have, so he could come at any moment. So we're seeing a third line. You've got your two lines, one that it could happen because everything's already happened, and one that's saying it can't happen yet. And actually, there was somebody he quoted that said it absolutely couldn't happen. It was, I think, Burkhoff. I didn't go back and look at Burkhoff myself, and I like Burkhoff, but if his quote was right, for him to say it absolutely couldn't happen, it makes you a little uncomfortable. And he takes the line of, it's not likely happened. It could have, but not likely. But the things that are left could happen very quickly, so we should be ready. And Grudem's concern is if we take the line that it hasn't happened, and therefore the people will get the short-timer, not the short-timers, but the lax attitude, to say that, well, it can't happen yet, so we don't need to worry. You say, no, we need to be yet working. He makes reference to the salvation of the man of sin and rebellion. And of course, there are some, and I kind of jumped ahead on that with it.
The salvation of the man?
No, the coming of the man of sin and rebellion. And he kind of talks about the different stances on that, and then he gets into the salvation of Israel, where some would say that, looking at Paul and all those who had been saved or were going to be saved have been happening, and there's no big turn. There are others that say, no, there still has to be a big turning that we see. And so, therefore, it can't happen yet. So in all of these, though, he takes this, what I think is a good stance in all of it. Let me jump back to the preaching of the gospel under his possible solutions. He says, it is unlikely but possible that the signs have already been fulfilled. He says that several other times. He says... it is unlikely but possible that the predictions of the Great Tribulation has already been fulfilled. He takes this take. Well, what he's trying to say is to say that some of those things may have been fulfilled, but it's unlikely. And the ones that we're most certain haven't happened, well, like you see, everybody's going to see him descending. In reality, in a moment, the stuff could happen with the sun and the sky, and the return of Christ could happen pretty quickly, and it could all roll.
Like an earthquake.
So what he's trying to say on this kind of midway is saying that I don't think that the fall of Jerusalem was the Great Tribulation, but it could have been. I think it's unlikely. I think it's yet to come. But it is possible that it could have been fulfilled. I'm not going to say it absolutely wasn't fulfilled somewhere along the way or one of these other Great Tribulations, but that these things may yet come. But even the things we see that we can pretty much say haven't happened could happen quickly.
Did the Lord himself, though, say it's going to be the worst that ever has been or will be?
Right, well...
For Hitler's camp was worse than...
Well, from some perspectives, we say Stalin was worse than that.
Right.
Mao maybe even worse.
That's what I'm
And
saying,
so,
it's worse than...
so
It hasn't happened yet.
So I think what he's trying to say is for those who say, he doesn't want to absolutely say it has not happened in some of these cases, to say, I think it's unlikely. I could be wrong, but I think it's unlikely. But these things are,
I think
yet to come.
It wasn't 70 AD.
His big concern in taking this stance was for us not to get in a lax attitude that we need not worry, that he sees the importance of us being ready. And that if we take kind of an absolute idea that like, it's not going to happen anytime soon, not going to happen in 100 years, that we'll tend towards laxness. And I think he's not talking about us living in a fear and tension, but just a practical reality that as we look at these and make interpretations and think maybe these things likely haven't happened or yet to happen, that we should not grow lax, thinking that they could not develop faster than we think they could. And that's his general take on this whole thing. In his final conclusion, he says, is it possible to be ready for something that we think unlikely to happen in the near future? It certainly is. Everyone who wears a seatbelt when driving or purchases auto insurance gets ready for an event that he or she thinks unlikely, but prepares for. And I think that's a good picture. We do things to prepare for things that and we say unlikely. Some of these things are more likely in the immediacy to happen, but not likely to happen, and yet we prepare for them. And it is spiritually unhealthy for us to say that we know that these signs have not occurred, and it seems to stretch the bounds of credible interpretation to say that we know that these signs have occurred. That seems a fair stance on this, to say that we really think some of these haven't been. We think some of them might have been, or to some degree might have been. We're not willing to take a stance against our brothers that are more adamant and say they're absolutely wrong, but to say, I'm not certain. And know that what's important is that we keep our eyes on Christ and that we keep working towards the end. So that's kind of the attitude he rolls into this with. I think for Grudem, and I would agree with him on the return of Christ, the issue is we believe he's going to come. We believe he's going to come the way he said he's going to come, and we believe that it's not going to, that we can see the signs, but it's not going to be a time we expect it, in a sense. So, and that we need to be ready. And if we all take that, then we can have discussions about whether we think this one's been fulfilled or this one hasn't been fulfilled, or why or what, and do all that in a healthy, Christ-like fashion. So, thoughts or questions? So, he didn't take any hard stance on any of this, other than that. I think pretty much I take from it that he doesn't think these things have happened, but he just doesn't want to say it. He's trying to be charitable and say, it could have happened, but I think it's unlikely.
It'll sell more books too. So.
Well, I don't think that was his point. I think his point was to not be divided over something he doesn't believe we should be divided over. And I would wholeheartedly agree with him on that. Is Christ going to return? Yes. Is he going to return like the Bible said? He said yes. On the rest of it, and he said we're not going to know ahead of time when. But yet he does say we should be able to see the signs when it happens and be expectant. So there's that kind of balance of having your eyes open and yet not having, a calendar date marked out and being worried about it. Well, if there are no thoughts or questions, we'll begin.
What's next Wednesday going to do with your travels?
We'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. And but with that, the next time we cover this will be the millennium, which should be interesting because I don't really have a stance on this, actually. So I'm a pan-millennialist still, because I'm still trying to understand.
Millennium?
Huh?
Pan? All?
No. It's when it happens, it's going to happen. It'll all pan out in the end.
Oh, my God. Ha! A non-technical use of pan. Sorry.
Yes.
Not like Pan America.
Yeah, no, not like that. Like it's all going to work out in the end. I say that because this is not something I've dedicated a lot of time to understanding. I know that there are good, godly men on the many sides of this issue, because this is not a two thing. This is like a 3 or 4 or 5 different views. One of the things I'm going to try to do for us by the time we get here is just come up with a list of definitions, because there are so many definitions. Amillennialist, this. I mean, they're like, I think just having the definitions in front of us will help us as we're working through this to just get a feel that a lot of good men, a lot of godly men, a lot of hardworking men have laid a lot of work to this, and they've come out in disagreement. I'm only uncertain where I stand because I haven't read it enough to have an honest opinion. I grew up in a pre-trib, pre-mill background. That's what I start out with, but over time I've come to question some of that, just mainly because a lot of my belief in that was not based on actually knowledge, but on just what I was told. So, and some things I was told about other camps have not proven to be true, but scarecrows or straw men. And so I have questions. I would like to read more. We'll get some brief on this. I don't know that this will make me decide even yet, but this will give us a push in that direction. This was something I wanted to read long before we covered it, but it hasn't happened. So we'll work through it. We'll share opinions on this, and irrespective of where we land, it'll all pan out in the end.
Pan-millennial. I'll have to write that one.
Well, I told that. You can go ahead and shut us down if you want. Good night, y'all. When I was first here, in my first month,